The afternoon sun dripped through the crystal chandeliers of the Forrester mansion, scattering gold across white lilies and silk ribbons that adorned the grand hall. The air was perfumed with roses, anticipation, and the quiet hum of whispered blessings. Hope Logan stood at the threshold of the aisle, her gown shimmering like a dream woven from light itself. Her heart fluttered as she looked ahead, where Liam Spencer waited, his expression soft, tender, and filled with the love she had fought so many storms to preserve. Every step she took down that aisle seemed to carry not just her body, but the fragile faith she still had in love, a faith reborn after every heartbreak. The guests rose in awe, Brooke's eyes glistening with pride as she clutched Ridge's arm. It was supposed to be a day of redemption, a moment where love triumphed over doubt. But as Hope neared the altar, a faint sound rose from somewhere nearby, a quiet, rhythmic murmur, the kind that didn't belong to celebration. It came from the adjacent sitting room, the one where the door had been left slightly ajar. Hope hesitated mid-step, confusion flickering across her face. The guests barely noticed as she slowed, her gaze drifting instinctively toward the sound, soft at first, then unmistakably human, a low gasp tangled with the whisper of fabric. Her pulse quickened, an icy chill creeping up her spine. Somewhere deep inside, something told her not to look, to keep walking, to ignore whatever strange interruption fate had planted in her path. But curiosity, that cruel sister of intuition, urged her closer. She turned her head, just slightly, and saw it, a fragment of black hair, tousled, shimmering under the chandelier's glow. A familiar shape, yet wrong somehow. Hope took one trembling step toward the door, her breath caught between disbelief and dread. The sound grew clearer now, a breath, a whisper, a sigh, and then, as she pushed the door open with a trembling hand, the world she knew ended. Inside the room, Liam sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, his shirt unbuttoned, his skin flushed with shame and adrenaline. In his arms, tangled in the remnants of white satin, was a woman, her back arched, her hair spilling over his shoulder in a cascade of midnight silk. For one terrible heartbeat, Hope's mind refused to connect the pieces. It couldn't be Luna. She was miles away, her twin sister's mirror image but gentle, reserved, incapable of something like this. Yet the face that turned toward Hope, lips curled into a cruel, knowing smile, was not Luna's. It was Luni, Luna's twin, the darker reflection that few in Los Angeles even knew existed. Luni's gaze was steady, fearless, almost mocking. Her hand rested possessively on Liam's chest, her fingers tracing the shape of his confusion as he stammered, frozen, caught in a moment that felt both accidental and inevitable. The room went silent, but for the sound of Hope's breath, shallow, trembling, the sound of a heart breaking mid-beat. Her bouquet slipped from her fingers and hit the marble floor, scattering white petals like fallen innocence. Brooke's cry echoed from the aisle as she ran toward her daughter, but Hope could only stare, her eyes wide and uncomprehending. Liam scrambled to his feet, his face pale with shock. "Hope," he began, but the word choked itself to death before it left his throat. The silence was louder than any excuse he could offer. Brooke reached Hope just as her knees gave way, catching her before she fell completely. Hope's body trembled in her mother's arms, her veil slipping, her mascara staining her cheeks. The guests, sensing the collapse of something sacred, stood frozen, unable to look away, unable to breathe. Bill Spencer, standing in the back of the room, took one long, heavy breath, his jaw clenched. His son again. His son, always ruled by weakness and impulse, always turning gold to ash. He closed his eyes, shaking his head slowly, the disappointment etched deep in his face. It wasn't just that Liam had betrayed Hope, it was that he had done it in the cruelest way possible, on the very day that was meant to heal everything between them. Luni, meanwhile, adjusted the strap of her ruined dress with deliberate slowness, her expression unflinching. "I guess timing was never your strength, Hope," she murmured under her breath, the corners of her mouth curling into that venomous smile. the smile of someone who had planned this moment, who had waited for it. It wasn't mere seduction. It was destruction, a performance staged for maximum cruelty. Hope tore free from Brooke's embrace and stumbled toward Liam, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why?" she asked, her lips trembling. "Why her?" Liam's mouth opened, but no sound came. He didn't even seem to understand himself how it had happened. One moment of confusion, one drink too many, one weakness exploited, but none of that mattered now. The truth was laid bare, and there was no redemption in it. He reached for her, but she recoiled as if his touch might burn her. Brooke stood between them, her protective fury blazing. "Don't," she warned him, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Don't come near her." For a brief, unbearable moment, everyone stood frozen. The guests, the family, the staff, each one witnessing the slow, exquisite collapse of what had been promised as a perfect day. Luni rose from the sofa, smoothed the wrinkles of her dress, and faced Hope directly. "You wanted a fairy tale," she said softly, her tone dripping with condescension. "You should have known those don't exist in this house." That was when Hope finally broke. She turned away, her sobs echoing through the hall, muffled only by Brooke's arms around her. The ceremony was over before it had begun. The vows turned to ashes. The dream dissolved into scandal. Luni walked out without shame, her heels clicking on the marble like a metronome of destruction, her head held high. Behind her, Liam stood motionless, drowning in the weight of what he had just lost. Hours later, the mansion stood quiet, its grandeur dimmed by whispers and the faint scent of crushed flowers. Hope sat alone in her dressing room, staring at her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked older, colder, her eyes hollow where Hope once lived. Brooke hovered nearby, her expression caught between rage and heartbreak. "He's destroyed you," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "But you won't let him keep you there."
Hope didn't respond.
She just stared at her reflection, trying to find meaning in the shards of her life. Somewhere in the house, Liam argued with his father. Bill's voice was low, furious, the kind of anger that carries disappointment rather than hate. "You've ruined everything," he said. "Do you have any idea what this will do to Hope? To your daughter? To all of us?" Liam had no answer. He didn't even remember how it had started. Luni had been around more lately, charming, mischievous, unpredictable. He thought she was Luna once or twice, and maybe that was the first mistake. But deep down, he knew this wasn't confusion. It was temptation, raw and primal, the kind he had never learned to resist. He had been weak, and Luni had known exactly how to exploit that weakness. When he finally sought Hope out later that night, she wouldn't see him. Brooke met him at the door, her eyes cold. "You've done enough," she said, her voice trembling with restrained fury. "Leave her alone." And so he did. He walked out into the cold night, the air thick with regret. Somewhere behind him, Luni watched from the balcony, her silhouette framed by moonlight. There was no remorse in her eyes, only satisfaction, the dark thrill of victory. She had wanted to expose the illusion, to tear apart the fairy tale, and she had succeeded. As days passed, the fallout spread like wildfire. The tabloids devoured the scandal, the headlines cruelly poetic. "Runaway bride finds husband in sister's arms." Hope withdrew from the public eye, from friends, even from her work. Brooke stayed close, shielding her as best she could, but she could not protect her from the betrayal that echoed in every room, every memory. Liam tried to make amends, but every word sounded hollow, every apology too late. He had destroyed not only Hope's faith in him, but her faith in love itself. And as for Luni, she thrived in the chaos she had created, invited to parties, whispered about in envy and disgust, feeding off the attention like oxygen. Yet even she, in her quietest moments, felt a strange emptiness. Victory was hollow when built on ruin. One evening, Hope returned to the Forrester estate, standing once more in the doorway of that same sitting room. The air still smelled faintly of roses and betrayal. She ran her fingers along the edge of the sofa, the ghost of that moment still imprinted there. "I'll never be that woman again," she whispered to herself. It wasn't bitterness. It was resolve. And from that day on, she wasn't. The betrayal that shattered her became the fire that reshaped her. She rebuilt herself piece by piece, slower, stronger, more deliberate. Love had broken her, but pain had taught her something purer than romance, the courage to stand alone. In time, the mansion would host other weddings, other vows, other fragile beginnings. But none would ever erase the echo of that day, the day innocence died in a house built on beauty and lies, the day Hope Logan learned that even the brightest love can turn to shadow when trust is gone. And somewhere, in the silence between past and future, Luni's laughter still lingered, a haunting reminder that sometimes betrayal doesn't destroy you. It awakens you. The cafe sat on the corner of Melrose and Crescent, one of those cozy places where the air smelled like roasted beans and old memories. Liam Spencer had been there countless times before, with hope, always with hope, sipping cappuccinos between laughter and long silences that only two people deeply in love could share. It was their place, a quiet sanctuary in a city that rarely stopped breathing. But that afternoon, the sunlight that spilled through the glass walls felt foreign, almost invasive, as if it were bearing witness to something that should have remained in shadow. Across from him sat Luni, Luna's twin sister, her dark hair spilling over her shoulders, her eyes glistening with a fragility that felt rehearsed, yet heartbreakingly convincing. Liam hadn't meant for this to happen. At first, it was curiosity, the kind that tugs softly at your conscience but feels harmless enough to entertain. Luni had come to him after a Forrester event weeks ago, her tone soft, her words edged with sadness. She had wanted to talk about Luna, about her sister's success, her struggles, her loneliness. She had said she felt invisible, overshadowed, forgotten, like a shadow in someone else's story. Liam, who had always seen himself as a savior of lost souls, had offered to listen. It was what he did, what had drawn hope to him years ago. But this time, compassion had led him somewhere far more dangerous. Now, as he looked across the table at Luni, something in him ached, not with love, not exactly, but with a strange mixture of guilt and sympathy. She was telling him about her childhood again, about the nights when Luna cried because their mother had been too drunk to remember their names, about how she had been the one to take care of them both, to keep the light on when darkness tried to swallow their home. "You know," she said quietly, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup, "everyone looks at Luna and sees grace, kindness, perfection. But no one sees what she left behind."
Me.
Liam reached across the table, his hand brushing hers in a gesture meant to comfort, but the contact lingered longer than it should have. Luni's lips quivered, her eyes filling with tears that caught the afternoon light like shattered glass. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice rough. "I can't imagine what that must have been like." She smiled faintly, shaking her head. "No one ever can. Not even Luna." Her voice broke on the last word, and Liam felt something stir inside him, a rush of protectiveness that blurred reason. Without thinking, he reached for a napkin and gently dabbed the tears from her cheek. It was a tender, almost paternal gesture, but in that instant, the space between them shifted. The air grew heavy, intimate. Her eyes rose to meet his, and the sadness there transformed into something else, something knowing. She leaned forward slightly, her breath warm against his face, and before Liam could process what was happening, her lips found his. It wasn't a soft kiss. It was hungry, urgent, fueled by all the wrong emotions, pity, loneliness, and the thrill of something forbidden. For a heartbeat, Liam froze. Then, without conscious thought, he returned the kiss, his hand sliding to the back of her neck as though trying to hold onto something real in a world that had spun out of control. When they finally pulled apart, the sound of their breathing filled the silence, mingling with the distant hum of the espresso machine. And that was when it happened, the moment that would unravel everything. Hope Logan, walking down the street with a small bouquet in her hand, lilies and soft pink roses, the kind Liam always said reminded him of her, caught sight of the cafe. She had planned to surprise him, to rekindle a spark that had dimmed under the weight of their constant miscommunication. But as she approached the window, her smile froze. Through the glass, she saw Liam, leaning across the table, his lips pressed against another woman's. At first, she thought her eyes were deceiving her. But then the woman shifted, and the light hit her face, revealing a truth so cruel that it felt like the universe itself had turned against her. It wasn't Luna. It was her twin. The bouquet fell from her hands, scattering petals across the pavement. The sound of her breath, sharp, wounded, fogged the glass for a moment before she stepped back, clutching her chest as if to physically hold her breaking heart together. Her vision blurred, the edges of the world collapsing inward. In that instant, time slowed to a cruel crawl, forcing her to absorb every detail. The way Liam's fingers lingered on Luni's cheek, the trace of guilt in his eyes as he looked at her, and the unmistakable intimacy between them. Inside the cafe, Liam turned his head instinctively toward the window, and the moment his gaze met Hope's, the world stopped. Her expression, shock, disbelief, devastation, sliced through him like a blade. He shot to his feet, knocking his chair over, but Hope was already walking away, her face pale, her steps unsteady. The sound of the bell above the door felt distant, irrelevant, as if the cafe itself had swallowed his voice when he tried to call her name. Luni, still seated, wiped her lips with a napkin and leaned back in her chair, her smirk subtle but unmistakable. "Well," she murmured, her tone almost amused, "that wasn't part of the plan, but it'll do." Liam spun toward her, his voice shaking. "What did you just say?" She looked up at him, her expression now cool, composed, as if she had slipped off one mask and put on another. "Relax," she said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "You're not the first man to make a mistake. And hope she'll come around. She always does, doesn't she?" Liam's stomach twisted. The realization hit him like ice. He had been played. The tears, the vulnerability, the perfect timing, all of it had been a performance.
But why?
What did she gain from this? Before he could demand an answer, a voice called from the doorway, deep, commanding, filled with disapproval. "Because she thinks she can control you, just like her sister once thought she could control everyone else." Bill Spencer stood there, arms crossed, his piercing gaze fixed on Luni. He had been at a meeting nearby and had seen everything unfold from across the street. Now, his voice carried the sharpness of a man who had seen too much manipulation in his life to fall for it again. "You're playing a dangerous game, young lady," he said, stepping closer. "And trust me, you don't know who you're dealing with." Luni rose slowly, meeting his stare with fearless defiance. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with," she said coolly. "A man who can't decide what he wants. A woman who loves him too much to let go. And a father who thinks he can scare me." She tilted her head slightly, a faint, mocking smile touching her lips. "You think I'm like Luna, soft, naive, desperate to please. But I'm not her. I don't break easily. I make others break." Bill's expression hardened. "You think you're smarter than her?" Luna's mistakes nearly destroyed her. "Don't follow the same path." Luni laughed, the sound low and chilling. "Luna fell because she believed in love. I don't make that mistake. Love is just a tool. And Liam? He's the easiest man in this town to use." The words made Liam flinch. His jaw tightened, his shame morphing into anger. "You planned this," he said slowly. "All of it."
Lun shrugged.
"Call it what you want. I call it strategy." Bill's eyes darkened. "You're walking into a fire you can't control. Then I'll dance in it," Luni replied simply. For a moment, the three of them stood there in tense silence. Bill, the embodiment of cold authority, Liam, the wreckage of guilt, and Luni, the spark that had lit a fuse none of them could put out. Then, without another word, Luni grabbed her purse and walked out, her heels clicking defiantly against the tiled floor. Outside, Hope was nowhere to be seen. She had driven away, her tears blurring the road, her mind replaying the image over and over again. The kiss, the betrayal, the cruel inevitability of it all. For her, this wasn't just another heartbreak, it was the death of something sacred. She had believed in Liam, not perfectly, not blindly, but deeply enough to think he would never hurt her like this again. Now, even the memories of their love felt poisoned. Back at the cafe, Liam sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "What have I done?" he whispered. Bill exhaled heavily and sat opposite him. "You let your weakness write your downfall, son." Again. "She lied to me," Liam muttered, his voice shaking. "She made me believe she was broken. She made me feel like I had to save her." Bill's gaze softened slightly. "And that's your problem, Liam. You don't fall in love, you fall into traps. And this one? It's going to cost you everything." Meanwhile, Luni walked down the street, her reflection trailing her in every shop window, a woman carved from the chaos she created. People stared, drawn to her beauty, unaware of the venom beneath it. She smiled to herself, not because she felt joy, but because control was her only true pleasure. Hope had been the symbol of purity, Luna the emblem of grace, but Luni was something else entirely, the embodiment of temptation, the mirror that showed everyone who they really were when their morals fell away. That night, Hope sat alone in her apartment, the lights dim, her phone buzzing relentlessly with messages she refused to read. She didn't need to. She knew the apologies would come, the explanations, the promises. But words had lost their meaning. What haunted her wasn't the kiss itself, but the fact that Liam had chosen to be there with another woman at all, in their cafe, the place where their love had once felt untouchable. It wasn't just betrayal, it was desecration. In another part of town, Bill made a call to a private investigator, his voice low and firm. "Find out everything you can about Luni. Where she came from, who she's been with, what she's after. This isn't over." And it wasn't. Because as the night deepened, the threads of deception began to tighten, pulling everyone, Liam, Hope, Bill, even Luna herself, into Luni's orbit. She had opened a door that none of them could close. And while they were still trying to make sense of what had happened, she was already planning her next move. For Luni, power was never about love or revenge. It was about proving that she could do what Luna never dared, to play with fire and never get burned. But what she didn't yet realize was that even the most careful manipulators eventually lose control of their own games. And somewhere, deep beneath the confidence and the smirk, a small flicker of something human still trembled, a shadow of the girl she used to be before the lies, before the poison, before the kiss that changed everything. By dawn, Hope's tears had dried into something colder, resolve. She looked out at the city, the skyline glowing in early light, and whispered to herself, "No more saving anyone. Not even him." And with that, she turned away from the window, unaware that the war Luni had started was only beginning, a war not just for love, but for identity, power, and survival in a world where even the purest hearts could turn dark when pushed too far.